I'm Miranda, 27 years old, and my father just pointed at me in front of a judge who happened to be his friend and said, "This girl only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve." He was demanding every penny of the fortune my grandfather left specifically to me in his will. The judge nodded in agreement while my father's lawyer smiled, certain of victory. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely betrayed by family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Because when I saw that judge nodding like my father's personal cheerleader, I knew exactly what was happening. See? I'd been expecting this little conspiracy ever since I saw those photos of them together during my father's campaign years ago. Politicians and their buddies. They really think they're so clever, don't they? But let me take you back to how we got to this courtroom showdown. Because this story starts 27 years ago when I took my first breath and my mother took her last. Congressman Richard Hayes never wanted to be a father. Made that crystal clear from day one when he decided that a newborn baby was somehow responsible for complications during childbirth. Yeah, you heard that right. My father blamed me for my mother's death. Real winner, this guy. While he was busy building his political career and pointing fingers at an infant, my paternal grandparents stepped in. Patricia and William Hayes weren't just my lifeline. They became my entire world. They took me home from the hospital while my father disappeared back to Washington, probably relieved he wouldn't have to figure out how to raise the daughter he'd never wanted in the first place. And honestly, their loss became my gain. My grandparents thought they were being helpful. They figured if they raised me with enough love and patience, maybe their son would eventually come around and want to be part of my life. Sweet, naive people who couldn't imagine their own child being such a complete disappointment. Growing up in their house was like living in a fairy tale. Except the prince in this story wanted absolutely nothing to do with the princess. Grandpa William would read me bedtime stories while Grandma Patricia taught me how to paint watercolors. They filled every birthday, every Christmas, every school event with so much love that I almost forgot there was supposed to be someone else there. Almost. Christmas mornings were perfect until I'd catch Grandma Patricia staring at her phone, hoping for a call that never came. Grandpa William would clear his throat and distract me with another present, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes every single time. The first time I asked why Daddy never visited, I was probably 5. Grandma Patricia's face crumpled for just a second before she composed herself. "He's very busy helping people, sweetheart. Important work." Even at 5, I could smell the BS in that explanation. But I learned not to ask, because every question about my father made the 2 people I loved most in the world look like someone had stepped on their hearts. By middle school, I'd stopped expecting him altogether. Parent-teacher conferences, Grandpa William was there taking notes, school plays, Grandma Patricia in the front row with that ancient camcorder she refused to replace, father-daughter dances, Grandpa William spinning me around the floor while I pretended not to notice the other girls with their actual fathers. But here's the thing. We were happy. Really, genuinely happy. Just the 3 of us against the world. And honestly, we didn't need some politician who couldn't be bothered to remember his daughter existed. Every major holiday, though, my grandparents would still call him. I'd watch Grandpa William dial that number with shaking hands, hoping this time would be different. Spoiler alert, it never was. But that persistent hope of theirs? That's what should have been my first warning about exactly how far my father would go when money was involved. The pattern of my father's absence became so predictable, I could have set a calendar by it. Christmas? Expensive gift delivered by his assistant with no personal note. Birthday? Generic card signed by someone who definitely wasn't him. Graduation? Radio silence so complete you'd think I'd cease to exist. Meanwhile, Grandpa William was building his business empire and Grandma Patricia was managing her family money like the Charleston aristocrat she'd been born to be. They could have spoiled me rotten, turned me into one of those trust fund brats you see on reality TV. Instead, they taught me values that my father had apparently never heard of. "Money is a tool, Miranda," Grandpa William would say while reviewing his business reports at the kitchen table. "It should serve a purpose, not become the purpose." Wise words from a man whose son had clearly missed that particular lesson. Grandma Patricia was equally grounded despite coming from serious old money. She volunteered at the children's hospital, taught Sunday school, and somehow always found time to help me with homework, even when she had charity board meetings to attend. They showed up for everything. Every soccer game where I spent more time on the bench than the field. Every science fair where my volcano looked like a sad mud pile compared to the other kids' projects. Every piano recital where I murdered Chopin with the enthusiasm of a tone-deaf elephant. Meanwhile, my father's political career was thriving. Congressman Hayes, champion of family values and fiscal responsibility. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a chainsaw. I'd see him on TV sometimes, giving passionate speeches about the importance of supporting our children and building strong family foundations. And I'd think, yeah, tell me more about family support, Dad. I'm all ears. When I turned 16, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was teenage rebellion, or maybe I just got tired of pretending his absence didn't sting. I started asking the questions my grandparents had been deflecting for years. Why doesn't he ever call me? I demanded one evening after seeing him on CNN discussing education reform. He talks about children's futures on national television, but he can't remember his own daughter has one. Grandpa William set down his newspaper slowly. Your father is dealing with complicated feelings about your mother's death. Sweetheart, grief affects people differently. For 16 years? I shot back. That's not grief, Grandpa. That's a choice, a really crappy one. Grandma Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. After 16 years of making excuses for their son, even they were running out of believable explanations. High school brought college preparation, and my grandparents went all out. SAT tutors, college visits, application fees, they supported every dream I mentioned. When I got into Duke University with a partial scholarship, they threw a celebration dinner that could have fed a small country. My father's response? A congratulations card with typed text and his assistant's initials at the bottom. Not even the courtesy of a personal signature. That's when I officially stopped caring whether he acknowledged my existence. I mean, what's the point of wanting approval from someone who treats you like an inconvenience he never signed up for? During college, I'd come home for holidays and watch my grandparents get a little older, a little more fragile. They'd ask about my classes, my friends, my plans with genuine interest because they actually cared about the person I was becoming. 21 years old, and I'd never had a real conversation with my biological father. 21 years of birthdays and holidays and accomplishments he'd missed by choice. I graduated summa cum laude with a business degree. Grandpa William cried during my valedictorian speech. Grandma Patricia took approximately 300 photos. My father's reserved seat remained empty, as usual. That night at dinner, Grandpa William raised his champagne glass. To Miranda, who proves every day that the best families are built on love, not biology. Looking back, I should have known he was already planning something big. Something that would finally force his son to show his true colors. But at the time, I just thought it was another toast from the man who'd been more of a father to me than my actual father ever was. College graduation was supposed to mark the beginning of my independent adult life. I moved back home temporarily while job hunting, and honestly, I was thrilled to be back with my grandparents. The house felt different, though. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with my being away. Grandma Patricia wasn't quite herself anymore. She moved slower in the mornings, and her hands had developed a slight tremor when she poured coffee. She'd get tired during our weekend shopping trips, needing to sit down more frequently than before. At first, I chalked it up to normal aging. She was in her 70s, after all. But something nagged at me, some instinct that whispered this wasn't just about getting older. Maybe we should schedule a checkup with Dr. Morrison, I suggested one Tuesday morning when she'd slept until 10, completely unlike her usual 6 a.m. routine. Oh, sweetheart, I'm fine. She waved me off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just tired from all that gardening yesterday. Except I hadn't seen her gardening in weeks. The changes accumulated gradually. Forgotten appointments that she'd never missed before. Questions repeated within the same conversation. Moments of confusion that she tried to hide behind her naturally cheerful demeanor, but I could see the worry creeping into her eyes. Grandpa William noticed too. I could tell by the way he hovered around her protectively, finishing her sentences when she struggled to find words. Gently steering conversations when she seemed lost. By Christmas, we couldn't pretend anymore. The woman who'd organized every family gathering for decades couldn't remember what day it was. She'd start cooking breakfast and forget about it until the smoke alarm reminded her. Once, I found her standing in the laundry room holding one of my shirts, staring at it like she'd never seen it before. I can't remember what I was doing, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. Miranda, I'm scared. That's when we knew we needed help. The diagnosis came on a rainy Tuesday in January. Early onset Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Morrison delivered the news as gently as possible. But there's no soft way to tell a family that their anchor is slowly disappearing. Grandpa William aged 10 years in that doctor's office. I watched this strong man who'd built companies and raised me through every childhood crisis simply crumble. His hands shook as he asked about treatments, about prognosis, about how much time we had left. 2 to 5 years, typically, Dr. Morrison said quietly. But every case is different. The most important thing now is creating a safe, loving environment and making her as comfortable as possible. I quit my new job the next day. Miranda, You can't put your life on hold for me, Grandma Patricia protested during one of her clear moments. You have so much ahead of you. My life is right here, I told her firmly. You raised me when no one else would. Now it's my turn to take care of you. And I meant every word. These people had given me everything that mattered. Love, stability, values, purpose. The least I could do was give them my time when they needed it most. For the next 2 years, I became her full-time caregiver. Some days were good, when she'd remember my name and we'd look through old photo albums together, laughing at pictures of my awkward teenage years. Other days were heartbreaking, when she'd look at me like a stranger and ask when her daughter was coming to visit. But the worst part wasn't watching her fade, though that was agony. The worst part was watching Grandpa William try desperately to reach his son during those 2 years, begging him to visit his dying mother. She talks about you, Grandpa William would say into the phone, his voice breaking. Please, Richard, just one visit. She asks about you every day. The answer was always the same. Too busy. Important votes coming up. Maybe next month. Next month never came. And watching my grandfather beg his own son for basic human decency was almost worse than watching my grandmother disappear. Have you ever experienced someone close to you getting a devastating diagnosis? Share your experiences in the comments below. Grandma Patricia died on a rainy Thursday morning in September, holding my hand while Grandpa William whispered how much he loved her. Her last coherent words were asking for Richard, wondering why her son hadn't come to see her. My father didn't attend the funeral. Let me say that again for the people in the back. Congressman Richard Hayes, the man who gave speeches about family values every chance he got, couldn't be bothered to attend his own mother's funeral. He called 3 days later, not to offer condolences, not to ask how his father was holding up, but to inquire about inheriting the lake house that had belonged to my grandmother's family for 4 generations. She's not even buried yet, I heard Grandpa William say into the phone, his voice shaking with a rage I'd never heard before. Your mother is dead, Richard. Dead. And you're calling about property? I stood outside his study, listening to my grandfather finally tell his son exactly what he thought about 30 years of neglect and selfishness. The conversation escalated quickly, with Grandpa William using language I'd never heard him use before. You want to know about inheritance? Grandpa William's voice rose to a shout. Here's what you're inheriting from me. Nothing. You couldn't be bothered to visit your dying mother, so you don't deserve a damn thing that came from her family. My father apparently tried to argue about his legal rights to family property, and that's when Grandpa William really lost it. Legal rights? He screamed. You gave up your rights when you abandoned this family. Don't you dare talk to me about what you deserve. The conversation ended with Grandpa William slamming down the phone so hard, I'm surprised it didn't break. For the first time in my life, I heard my grandfather use every curse word in the English language. Twice. That selfish, ungrateful piece of... He started, then noticed me standing in the doorway. His face softened immediately. I'm sorry you had to hear that, sweetheart. Don't apologize, I said firmly. He deserved every word and probably a few more. That phone call changed something fundamental in my grandfather. The man who'd spent decades hoping his son would come around finally accepted that Richard Hayes was exactly who he'd chosen to be. Someone who put his political career above everything and everyone else. After the funeral, the house felt like a museum of memories. Grandpa William moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching Grandma Patricia's favorite chair, straightening pictures that were already perfectly straight, sitting at the kitchen table where she used to drink her morning coffee. I'd find him there sometimes at dawn, just staring at her empty chair with tears streaming down his face. This man who'd been my rock through everything was completely shattered, and I knew I had to hold us both together. She always said you were the best thing that came from Richard, he told me one evening as we sorted through her jewelry. She was right. You're everything she hoped you'd become. We developed new routines to fill the silence. I moved into the guest room closest to his bedroom, just in case he needed anything during the night. We started taking evening walks around the property, talking about business, about memories, about everything except how much we missed her. I enrolled him in a grief support group at the community center, then secretly joined one myself. We were both drowning, but at least we were drowning together. Grandpa William had always been sharp in business, but grief affected him differently than I expected. Some days he'd be completely normal, handling conference calls and reading financial reports. Other days he'd seem lost and vulnerable, asking me the same question multiple times. His business associates started looking to me for answers. His lawyers began including me in important meetings. His financial advisor gradually shifted from consulting with him to consulting with me when Grandpa William lost interest in details he'd once managed obsessively. You're a natural at this, his estate attorney, Mr. Peterson, told me after a particularly complex meeting. Your grandfather trained you well. Maybe he had. Or maybe I'd absorbed more from those childhood evenings watching him work than I'd realized. Either way, I was apparently good at managing things when people I loved needed protection, which was fortunate because I was about to need every skill I'd learned. The 3 years after Grandma Patricia's death became the most important of my life, not just because I was caring for the man who'd raised me, but because I was discovering exactly what I was capable of when the people I loved were threatened. Grandpa William never completely gave up hope that his son would come around. He'd mention my father occasionally, wondering if grief might eventually bring them back together. I learned not to argue, but privately I knew better. Anyone who could ignore his dying mother wasn't suddenly going to develop a conscience. During those 3 years, my father's political career continued flourishing. He'd been re-elected twice, was being mentioned as a possible Senate candidate, appeared regularly on talk shows discussing, and I kid you not, the importance of family unity and moral responsibility. The man who hadn't spoken to his grieving father in 3 years was publicly championing strong family bonds. You honestly couldn't write irony that perfect. Do you think he'll ever understand what he's lost? Grandpa William asked one evening as we watched the sunset from the back porch. I think he's exactly who he wants to be, I answered honestly. Someone who doesn't have to worry about other people's feelings getting in the way of his ambitions. Grandpa William nodded slowly. Then he's lost more than he'll ever know. I didn't realize until much later that he was already planning how to make sure my father's selfishness couldn't hurt me the way it had hurt them. The signs were subtle at first. Meetings with Mr. Peterson that I wasn't invited to. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Documents he'd review privately instead of asking for my input like he'd started doing with everything else. When I asked about it, he'd just smile and say he was updating some old paperwork. Nothing urgent. I trusted him completely, which is probably why I never suspected he was orchestrating what would become the biggest surprise of my life. Grandpa William's health declined gradually over that final year, but his mind remained sharp when it came to business and family matters. He still woke every morning at 6, read multiple newspapers cover to cover, and could recall investment details that impressed his advisors. But I noticed the small changes. He tired more easily during our evening walks. He started needing afternoon naps, something the energetic man who'd raised me had never required. His appetite decreased, and he'd push food around his plate during the dinners I'd learned to cook from Grandma Patricia's old recipe cards. "Are you feeling all right?" I'd ask when I caught him staring out the window instead of eating. "Just thinking about your grandmother," he'd say with a sad smile. "Some days I miss her so much it feels like a physical ache." Dr. Morrison said his heart was simply wearing out, not from disease, but from a lifetime of hard work and the stress of losing his life partner. "He's grieving in his own way," the doctor explained. "Sometimes the heart can't distinguish between emotional pain and physical strain." I understood. Some nights I'd hear him talking to Grandma Patricia's picture on his nightstand, telling her about his day or asking her opinion about business decisions. It would have been heartbreaking if it wasn't so incredibly sweet. During what turned out to be his final year, we grew even closer. He started sharing stories about his childhood, his early business ventures, mistakes he'd made, and lessons he'd learned. It felt like he was passing down everything he wanted me to know about life and survival. "The most important thing I can teach you," he said one evening as we sat in his study, "is that loyalty must be earned, not inherited. Your father thinks family means automatic entitlement to forgiveness and support. That's not how real relationships work." He was preparing me for something, though I didn't understand what at the time. The lawyers visited more frequently during those months. Mr. Peterson would arrive with thick folders, and they'd disappear into the study for hours. When I'd ask about it, Grandpa William would just say he was getting his affairs in order to make things easier for me later. I should have pressed for details, but honestly, I didn't want to think about a future without him. He was the last connection to my childhood, to everything stable and loving in my world. But he was planning something that would change everything. The end came suddenly on a Tuesday morning in March. I found Grandpa William in his favorite leather chair in the study, still wearing his reading glasses and holding the morning financial reports. He looked peaceful, like he'd simply fallen asleep while checking his investments. The paramedics said his heart had just stopped, probably sometime before dawn. No pain, no struggle, just the quiet end of a life well lived. I called Mr. Peterson before I called anyone else, though I couldn't exactly explain why. Maybe because Grandpa William had always handled difficult situations by calling his lawyer first. Maybe because I already sensed that his death would bring complications I wasn't prepared for. "I'll be right there," Mr. Peterson said immediately. "Don't call anyone else until I arrive, Miranda. That's very important." Within an hour, he was sitting across from me in the same study where Grandpa William had spent his final moments, holding a thick envelope with my name written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "Your grandfather was a very thorough man," Mr. Peterson began carefully. "He anticipated several possible scenarios following his death, and he wanted to make sure you were protected." Protected from what? I wondered, but I was about to find out. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday, giving me exactly 1 week to process what Mr. Peterson warned would be an unusual situation. I spent those days making funeral arrangements while trying to understand the lawyer's cryptic warnings about potential challenges. Grandpa William's service was beautiful and heartbreaking. The church was packed with business associates, community leaders, and family friends who'd watched him live with integrity for 8 decades. I delivered a eulogy about the man who'd taught me everything important about life, love, and loyalty. My father didn't attend this funeral either. He didn't call, didn't send flowers, didn't acknowledge that his father had died. 3 days after losing the last parent he'd ever have, Congressman Richard Hayes remained completely silent. Some things never change, right? The will reading took place in Mr. Peterson's downtown office, all dark wood paneling and serious leather chairs. I arrived early, partly from nervousness and partly because punctuality was one of many values Grandpa William had drilled into me. "Coffee?" Mr. Peterson offered, gesturing toward an elegant service set up on the side table. "This might take a while." I was adding cream to my cup when the office door opened and my father walked in. It had been months since I'd seen him in person, probably at some political fundraiser where he'd acknowledged me with a polite nod across the room like I was a distant acquaintance. Today, he looked very interested indeed. Funny how money brings out people's sudden desire to reconnect with family. "Miranda," he said with his practiced politician smile, like we were old friends meeting for lunch. "I'm sorry about William. This must be very difficult for you." The casual use of his father's first name, like they'd been equals instead of estranged father and son, made my skin crawl. But I managed a polite nod and turned back to my coffee. My father's lawyer arrived next, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as James Morrison. He shook hands with my father like they were old colleagues, which they probably were. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Peterson asked once everyone was seated around the conference table. The first part of the will was straightforward enough. Charitable donations to organizations Grandpa William had supported for decades. Generous bequests to longtime employees. A college fund for the groundskeeper's children. Then came the part that changed everything. "To my son, Richard Hayes," Mr. Peterson read in his careful lawyer's voice, "I leave my complete disappointment in the man he chose to become, and my sincere hope that he will someday understand what he lost by abandoning his family." You could have heard a pin drop in that room. My father's face went through several interesting color changes. Red, then white, then an alarming shade of purple. His lawyer started to object, but Mr. Peterson held up a hand. "To my beloved granddaughter, Miranda Hayes, who has shown more love, loyalty, and integrity in 27 years than her father has demonstrated in his entire life, I leave the entirety of my estate. All properties, investments, business holdings, and personal assets shall transfer to Miranda immediately upon my death." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. If I thought the silence after the will reading was uncomfortable, the explosion that followed was downright volcanic. My father's lawyer was on his feet before Mr. Peterson had even finished reading, spouting legal objections like a malfunctioning sprinkler system. "This will is clearly the product of undue influence and diminished capacity," he declared with all the indignation money could buy. "We'll be filing challenges immediately." But Mr. Peterson just smiled like he'd been expecting exactly this reaction. "Your grandfather anticipated that response, Miranda. That's why he spent the last year meticulously documenting his mental competence and the reasoning behind his decisions." He opened another envelope and pulled out medical records, psychological evaluations, and what appeared to be a handwritten letter dated just 2 weeks before Grandpa William's death. "He also wanted me to give you this," Mr. Peterson said, handing me the letter, "to read after your father heard the will." My hands shook slightly as I unfolded the paper and recognized Grandpa William's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Miranda, if you're reading this, then Richard has just learned that actions have consequences. You are my heir because you earned it through love, loyalty, and character. He is not my heir because he chose politics over family, ambition over love, and selfishness over responsibility. What happens next will show you exactly who he really is. Trust Mr. Peterson, trust yourself, and remember that the best revenge is living well. All my love, Grandpa William." I looked up to find my father staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not grief, not remorse, not even embarrassment. Pure, calculating fury. That's when I knew this was just the beginning of the war. My father didn't waste time on subtlety. Within 48 hours of the will reading, the full force of his political machinery was aimed squarely at destroying my reputation and forcing me into submission. It started with the phone calls from reporters asking loaded questions about my relationship with my grandfather. Then came the carefully planted stories in local newspapers about family disputes and inheritance battles that somehow made me sound like a manipulative gold digger who'd isolated a vulnerable elderly man. The media blitz was sophisticated and coordinated, definitely not the work of some upset family member. This was political opposition research turned against his own daughter. He's trying to control the narrative, Mr. Peterson explained during an emergency meeting at his office. Classic political strategy: shape public opinion before the case gets to court. The legal challenges came next, wave after wave of motions questioning every aspect of my relationship with my grandparents. They wanted my medical records, my college transcripts, my employment history, basically anything they could use to paint me as unstable or financially desperate. But here's the thing about growing up with business people: you learn to keep good records. I had documentation for everything, from my academic scholarships to my employment offers to my decision to quit my job to care for Grandma Patricia. My life was an open book, and every page told the story of someone who'd never needed or asked for anything from anyone. The pressure campaign escalated when reporters started camping outside my house, shoving microphones in my face every time I stepped outside. They'd ask whether I felt guilty about keeping a son from his rightful inheritance, and if I thought I'd manipulated a grieving widower, rightful inheritance, from a man he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. The audacity was actually impressive. But my father had made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed I was still that little girl who desperately wanted his approval, who'd been hurt by his rejection, who'd do anything to avoid public conflict with the powerful Congressman Hayes. Instead, he was dealing with the woman his parents had raised, someone who understood that some fights are worth having, no matter who's on the other side. And I was about to remind him exactly where I'd learned to be this stubborn. What do you think Miranda's next move should be? Share your predictions in the comments below. My father's masterstroke came 3 weeks before our court date, and I have to admit it was brilliant in its simplicity. If he couldn't win the legal battle on merit, he'd just make sure he controlled who made the decision. I was reading the morning newspaper when I saw it. A photo from a political fundraiser showing Congressman Hayes sharing a laugh with several local dignitaries, including Judge Martin Crawford, who happened to preside over probate cases in our county. "Old friends from law school," read the caption, "still making time for each other despite busy schedules." I stared at that photo for a long moment, feeling my stomach drop. Judge Crawford would be hearing our case in exactly 3 weeks. The same Judge Crawford who was apparently such good friends with my father that they posed for pictures together at political events. Of course, because why would anything about this situation be fair or straightforward? The funny thing is, I'd actually seen photos of them together before. During my father's various campaign seasons, there'd been pictures in the paper, mentions on social media, the usual political glad-handing that comes with running for office in a small state where everyone knows everyone. I'd never paid much attention at the time, just another politician schmoozing with another local official. But now, with our inheritance case assigned to Judge Crawford's courtroom, those friendly photos took on a much more sinister meaning. I called Mr. Peterson immediately. "This is highly irregular," he said after I faxed him the newspaper clipping. "A judge should recuse himself if he has a personal relationship with one of the parties. So we file a motion asking him to step aside? We can try. But it's not that simple. We'd need to prove an actual conflict of interest, not just that they know each other professionally. And if we challenge it, your father's team will argue we're forum shopping because we don't like our assigned judge." So the system was rigged, and my father knew exactly how to work it. But I'd learned a few things about systems from watching Grandpa William navigate business deals for 27 years. Every system has weaknesses, and every powerful person has something they don't want exposed. The legal pressure continued building as we approached the court date. My father's team filed motion after motion demanding access to every detail of my life, looking for anything they could use to support their undue influence theory. They wanted proof that I'd isolated my grandfather from his loving son, evidence that I'd manipulated a confused elderly man for financial gain, documentation of my supposedly unstable mental state that made me unfit to inherit anything. What they got instead was a paper trail showing a woman who'd never asked for anything, never needed anything, and had turned down lucrative opportunities to care for family members who needed her. The fishing expedition backfired spectacularly, but that didn't stop them from trying new angles of attack. 2 weeks before the hearing, the pressure campaign took a more personal turn. Someone, and I'm sure it was a complete coincidence, leaked my home address to every news outlet in the state. Suddenly, I had camera crews camping on my front lawn 24 hours a day. Anonymous tips started appearing on social media questioning my mental stability and suggesting I'd financially abused my grandfather. Blog posts wondered aloud whether I was qualified to manage the inheritance I was trying to steal. It was a coordinated character assassination, designed to make me look like exactly the kind of person who would manipulate a vulnerable elderly man. The strategy was sophisticated, ruthless, and completely typical of the man who'd spent his entire career putting politics ahead of family. But while my father was busy trying to destroy my reputation, I was quietly preparing something that would end this charade once and for all. You see, I'd been thinking about those photos of him and Judge Crawford. Not just the recent ones, but all the ones I'd seen over the years. Campaign events, charity dinners, social gatherings where they'd posed together like old friends. And I'd been documenting them. Every single one I could find. Because if my father wanted to play games with the judicial system, I was going to remind everyone exactly what the rules were supposed to be. The week before our court date, I spent every spare moment going through old newspapers, campaign websites, and social media posts. What I found was exactly what I'd expected. Years of photographic evidence showing my father and Judge Crawford together at various political and social events. Not just casual professional encounters, but the kind of friendly, relaxed photos you take with someone you actually like and trust. Campaign fundraisers where they were clearly enjoying each other's company. Charity events where they posed with their arms around each other's shoulders. Even a few family-style gatherings where their wives appeared in the same pictures. These weren't distant professional acquaintances who occasionally crossed paths at official functions. These were friends. Close enough friends that they'd maintained a relationship spanning multiple election cycles and social seasons. The kind of friendship that should have made Judge Crawford recuse himself the moment our case landed on his desk. I made copies of everything I could find and organized them chronologically. The pattern was clear. This wasn't some recent political alliance or casual professional relationship. They'd been genuinely close for years, probably dating back to those law school days mentioned in the newspaper caption. Mr. Peterson reviewed my collection with interest but cautioned against overconfidence. "These photos prove they're friends," he said, "but we'd still need to show that the friendship creates an actual conflict of interest. The judge could argue that he's capable of being impartial despite their personal relationship. Even when one friend is asking him to take money away from someone and give it to the other friend, that's the argument we'd make. Yes, but judges have wide discretion in these matters, and Crawford could simply claim he's following the law regardless of personal feelings. In other words, Judge Crawford could rule against me, claim he was just interpreting the will objectively, and nobody could prove otherwise. Unless, of course, he was stupid enough to show obvious bias in open court. The night before the hearing, I sat in Grandpa William's study, reviewing everything we'd prepared. Medical records proving his mental competence right up until his death. Witness testimony from doctors and business associates who'd interacted with him regularly. Documentation showing the careful thought he'd put into his estate planning. But my real weapon wasn't any of those official documents. It was a simple manila folder containing 24 photographs spanning 15 years, showing Judge Crawford and my father together at events ranging from political rallies to what looked like private dinner parties. Pictures that told the story of a friendship close enough that Crawford should never have agreed to hear this case in the first place. I also had something else. A pretty good sense of my father's personality, after 27 years of watching him operate. He was arrogant, used to getting his way, and not particularly good at hiding his feelings when things didn't go according to plan. If Judge Crawford started showing the kind of obvious favoritism I expected, my father would probably get cocky enough to say something that revealed just how predetermined this whole proceeding really was. All I had to do was wait for the right moment, then remind everyone in that courtroom exactly what the rules were supposed to be. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that projected competence and respectability. I wanted to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously, not dismissed as an emotional young woman making wild accusations. I also made sure to have those photographs organized and ready. If things went the way I expected, I was going to need them. The courthouse was packed when I arrived. Word had spread about the political family inheritance battle, and reporters lined the hallway hoping for drama. I walked past them without comment, carrying myself with the confidence Grandpa William had taught me. Judge Crawford's courtroom was standing room only. My father sat at the plaintiff's table looking every inch the distinguished statesman wronged by his ungrateful daughter. He'd even worn his American flag lapel pin, because apparently subtlety had never been his strong suit. When he saw me, he attempted what I guess was supposed to be a paternal smile. It looked more like a shark showing its teeth. Judge Crawford entered with his usual judicial authority, taking his place behind the bench with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled the entire situation. He had no idea what was about to hit him. The hearing began exactly as I'd expected it would, with my father's lawyer presenting a masterful piece of legal theater designed to paint my grandfather as a confused old man manipulated by his scheming granddaughter. They had medical records taken out of context, testimony from distant relatives who claimed Grandpa William had seemed different in his final months, and financial documents presented in ways that made my caregiving look suspicious instead of loving. It was all carefully crafted nonsense, but it was well-presented nonsense delivered by expensive lawyers who clearly knew how to work their audience. And Judge Crawford was definitely their audience. He nodded sympathetically throughout their presentation, asked pointed questions about my grandfather's mental state, and seemed genuinely concerned about the possibility that a vulnerable elderly man had been taken advantage of. The bias was so obvious it was almost insulting. This wasn't a judge carefully weighing evidence. This was a friend helping out another friend. When it was our turn, Mr. Peterson methodically presented our case. Medical evaluations proving Grandpa William's mental sharpness right up until his death. Testimony from doctors and business associates confirming his clear thinking. Documentation showing the careful consideration he'd put into his estate planning. Judge Crawford's interest visibly waned during our presentation. He checked his watch, shuffled papers, and asked fewer questions than he had during my father's case. By the time Mr. Peterson finished, it was clear that Judge Crawford had already made up his mind. We were just going through the motions of a fair hearing while he prepared to deliver the ruling his friend wanted. That's when I knew it was time to change the game entirely. Your Honor, Mr. Peterson said as he concluded our formal presentation, before you make your ruling, my client has something she'd like to address with the court. Judge Crawford looked annoyed that the granddaughter wanted to speak instead of letting the lawyers handle everything. Miss Hayes, this is highly irregular. Your attorney has presented your case quite thoroughly. I understand, Your Honor, I said, standing slowly and picking up the manila folder I'd placed beside my chair. But there's an important matter I need to bring to your attention before you make any decisions about this case. I could see my father's lawyer whispering urgently in his ear, probably warning him that I was about to try something unexpected. But my father just sat back with a confident smirk, probably figuring that whatever his daughter was planning couldn't possibly threaten his carefully orchestrated victory. Poor man had no idea what was coming. Your Honor, I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, before you rule on this matter, I believe there's something important you should consider. I opened the folder and pulled out the first photograph, the recent newspaper clipping showing Judge Crawford and my father laughing together at a political fundraiser. This photograph shows you and my father together at what appears to be a social gathering rather than an official function, I said, holding it up so everyone in the courtroom could see it. Judge Crawford's expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching alarm. Miss Hayes, professional acquaintance is not grounds for recusal. You're absolutely right, I agreed pleasantly. Professional acquaintance isn't grounds for recusal, but close personal friendship certainly is. I pulled out another photograph, this one from an older campaign event where they were clearly enjoying themselves at what looked like a private celebration. And this picture, taken during my father's first congressional campaign, suggests a relationship that goes well beyond casual professional contact. The courtroom was completely silent now. I could see reporters scribbling notes and my father's confident expression starting to crack around the edges. But I was just getting started. I pulled out photograph after photograph, each one showing Judge Crawford and my father in increasingly social, friendly situations spanning more than a decade. Campaign celebrations where they were obviously having a great time together. Charity events where they posed like old friends. Even what appeared to be family gatherings where both their wives were present. Your Honor, I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm and professional, I have documentation spanning 15 years showing that you and my father have maintained what can only be described as a close personal friendship. Judge Crawford's face had gone pale, but he was still trying to maintain his judicial composure. Miss Hayes, these allegations are highly inappropriate. They're not allegations, I interrupted politely but firmly. They're documented facts supported by photographic evidence, newspaper reports, and public records spanning multiple election cycles. I spread more photos across the defense table. Campaign fundraisers where you've donated money to my father's political campaigns, social events where you've publicly endorsed his candidacy, charity dinners where you've served together on organizing committees. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. My father was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, probably realizing for the first time that his dismissed daughter had been paying attention all these years. Judge Crawford cleared his throat nervously. Miss Hayes, even if we were personal friends, which I'm not conceding, I am perfectly capable of being impartial in matters of law. That's when my father made his fatal mistake. Standing up at his table, his face red with anger and frustration at seeing his carefully orchestrated plan falling apart, he pointed directly at me and shouted the words that would destroy both their credibility. "This girl only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve." Judge Crawford nodded in agreement before he could stop himself, then immediately realized what he'd just done. The bias he'd been trying to hide was now on full display for every reporter and court observer to witness. Perfect. I looked Judge Crawford directly in the eyes and delivered the line I'd been preparing for weeks. Se vó quer atuar favoravelmente a ele, eu entrego às autoridades competentes as provas de que vó quer o amigos. Como as fotos públicas de vocês juntos tiradas na campanha política dele, tenho tudo documentado. Vó Keno pode ser juiz e amigo dele ao mesmo tempo. Isso acabaria com sua carreira. Wait. Let me say that in English, so everyone understands exactly what I'm telling this corrupt judge. If you act favorably toward him, I'll turn over to the appropriate authorities proof that you two are friends, including public photos of you together taken during his political campaigns. I have everything documented. You can't be both judge and his friend at the same time. This would end your career. The courthouse fell so silent you could have heard a pin drop 3 counties away. Judge Crawford's face went through several color changes, white to gray to an alarming shade of green. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his gavel. The man who'd walked into this courtroom confident in his ability to deliver a predetermined outcome was suddenly realizing that his entire judicial career was about to end in disgrace. We are not friends," he stammered, his voice barely audible, "and I will not act favorably toward the plaintiff." His voice grew slightly stronger as he continued, probably figuring this was his only chance to save himself. "We have an explicit will here from a man who was clearly of sound mind when he wrote it. The medical evidence supports his mental competence. The witness testimony confirms his intentions, and there are no grounds for overturning his clearly stated wishes." He paused, swallowing hard. "The inheritance will remain exactly as William Hayes specified in his testament. Case dismissed." He banged his gavel with shaking hands and immediately bolted from the bench, not even bothering with proper closing procedures. My father sat frozen at his table, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. 27 years of dismissing me as irrelevant, and I'd just demolished his entire scheme in under 30 minutes. The reporters were already rushing for the exits. Cell phones pressed to their ears as they called in the story of the decade. As the courtroom emptied, my father slowly stood and walked toward me. For a moment, I thought he might actually try to apologize or explain, or somehow salvage what was left of our relationship. Instead, he looked me in the eye and said, "You've destroyed everything I worked my entire life to build." "No," I replied calmly, packing the photographs back into their folder. "I exposed what you actually built your life on. There's a difference." He left the courtroom without another word, his expensive lawyers trailing behind him like mourners at a funeral. Justice wasn't just served. It came with a bow on top. 6 months later, I was standing in the garden behind what was now officially my house, watching the sunset paint the sky over the roses Grandma Patricia had planted decades ago. The legal battle was over, but more importantly, I'd finally found the peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The aftermath of that courtroom confrontation had been even more satisfying than the victory itself. Judge Crawford resigned within the week, citing health concerns that fooled absolutely no one. The State Judicial Review Board launched an investigation that uncovered a pattern of questionable decisions in cases involving my father's political allies. My father's career imploded even more spectacularly. The House Ethics Committee opened an investigation into his use of political connections for personal gain. The State Bar Association started looking into Judge Crawford's involvement with my father's various legal matters over the years. Congressman Richard Hayes announced his resignation from Congress 3 months later, claiming he wanted to spend more time with family. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on anyone who knew our actual family history, but I wasn't interested in revenge or watching him suffer. I was too busy building the life my grandparents had always wanted me to have. I kept Grandpa William's business empire, but modernized the companies with practices that would have made him proud. Employee profit sharing, environmental responsibility, community investment, the kind of values-driven approach he'd always talked about but never quite implemented. The businesses thrived under management that actually cared about more than just quarterly profits. 8 months after the trial, I met David Richardson at a sustainable business conference where I was speaking about corporate responsibility. He was an environmental engineer who specialized in clean manufacturing processes, passionate about creating systems that worked for both companies and communities. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours and covered everything from renewable energy systems to the moral obligations of inherited wealth. He was intelligent, principled, and completely unimpressed by my money, which I found incredibly attractive. I judge people by what they build, not what they inherit, he told me over coffee after our third date. And what you're building with those companies is genuinely impressive. We were engaged within a year, married in the same church where I'd delivered eulogies for both my grandparents. It was a beautiful ceremony with close friends and the family I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been born into. My father didn't attend, obviously. According to the newspaper reports, he was too busy dealing with federal investigators looking into his political activities. David and I honeymooned in Ireland, visiting the countryside where Grandma Patricia's family had originated 3 generations earlier. Standing on cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, holding hands with the man I loved while surrounded by beauty that had endured for centuries, I felt the profound peace that comes from living authentically. A year later, we moved permanently into the main house where I'd grown up. We converted Grandpa William's study into David's home office and transformed Grandma Patricia's art room into a nursery. Our daughter, Patricia Rose Richardson, was born on a perfect spring morning exactly 2 years after the trial that changed everything. She has David's gentle nature and my grandmother's bright eyes, and she'll grow up knowing she's loved unconditionally by parents who chose each other deliberately. Our son, William David Richardson, arrived 18 months later with my stubborn streak and his father's calm temperament. He'll never doubt for a second that he's wanted and valued. My children will grow up in the same house where I learned about love, loyalty, and the difference between family and biology. They'll hear stories about great-grandparents who showed them that the best inheritance isn't money, it's values, integrity, and the unshakable knowledge that they deserve love simply for existing. My father had spent his entire life chasing power and status that never satisfied him. He'd sacrificed every meaningful relationship for career advancement that ultimately meant nothing when his corruption was exposed. Meanwhile, I'd inherited something far more valuable than any fortune: the wisdom to recognize what actually matters and the strength to fight for it when necessary. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about family, justice, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Sometimes the people who underestimate us the most are the ones who end up learning the hardest lessons about our true strength. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember, the best inheritance isn't money or property. It's the values that guide us, the love that sustains us, and the security that comes from knowing exactly who we are and what we're worth. In the end, that's what my grandparents really left me. Not just financial security, but the unshakable knowledge that I was worthy of love, capable of strength, and destined for something infinitely better than the small, selfish life my father had chosen, and that inheritance will last for generations.